welcome to the Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we'll be analysing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 9th July 2019. The topics to be discussed today are reflected on your screen and the timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. So let's begin. This news is a lead article appearing on page number 10, and in this the authors are saying that the demand by various land-owning castes and communities for reservation is simply reinforcing the caste hierarchies in the society, and such demand for reservation is more based on their perceived deprivation rather than real backwardness. The discussion of ours will become relevant both from the perspective of GS Paper 1, where reservation as a tool of reinforcing caste hierarchies can become important when we are talking about the Indian society. And this will also become important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, where we are talking about reservation as a tool of the government to better the polity and governance of our country. The background of this news is that Marathas have been provided reservation in jobs as well as in educational institution as a separate category of socially and educationally backward class. Though the Maharashtra state legislature had passed an act which provided for 16% reservation for them, but the Bombay High Court has reduced this reservation to 12 to 13%. Now, as mentioned in the beginning, the main idea which the author is trying to draw home here is that of late, various dominant castes which are mostly rich and land owning as well as politically influential have started to ask for reservation or quotas. Hence, in this entire article, the author is saying that this demand by such communities is based more on the fact that they perceive themselves to be backward than them being actually backward in reality. And to bring out the point that their backwardness and deprivation is more perceived rather than real, the author compared various socio-economic indicators of this rich land-owning caste, especially the Marathas, with other categories such as Brahmins, OBC, STs and SCs. Hence, the author has analysed the data from the Indian Human Development Survey. Now, in this article, the author is mentioning a lot of figures. We will not be looking at those figures because numbers are not important, but will rather try to capture what those numbers are saying. Now, at the outset, let us first talk about the data which the author has presented. Now, the author says that the Marathas, just like the Jats and the Patels, are more likely to own or cultivate land than other social groups like the Brahmins, OBCs, STs or the SCs. Hence, the first point which we get here is that the access of Marathas to land, which has a lot of social and economic value in our Indian society, is much better than other social groups. Because in India, owning land is seen as a status symbol, and whoever owns a land is considered to be affluent or wealthy. Secondly, the author has compared various socio-economic indicators. For example, the education level, the consumption expenditure, the access to toilets, the access to electricity, the wealth, etc. Hence, for all the crucial socio-economic indicators, the author has found out that the Marathas come second only to the Brahmins in the state and rather perform significantly much better than other social groups like the OBCs, STs and the SCs. Hence, the second point is that the Marathas are much better socially and economically when compared to the OBCs, STs and the SCs, and in fact comes second only to the Brahmins, which is considered as an upper caste in Indian society. Hence, all in all, the author is saying, though the Marathas have been constituted as a separate socially economically backward class, yet their backwardness is not as severe as it seems to be. Now, having discussed the data which the author has provided, the next question which comes to mind is then, if these Marathas are not as backward as the OBCs, STs and the SCs, why are they so fervently asking for reservation? Well, to understand their demand, one thing which we need to understand is that reservation today is more of an economic problem rather than a social problem. No doubt, the genesis or the birth of reservation lied in untouchability and social backwardness, but today, in the present context, various castes and communities in India are fighting with one another to be called backward because they are facing several economic problems and they feel that reservation is an answer to such economic problems. Let us understand this by taking the examples of the Marathas themselves. Now, the author is saying that the Marathas in Maharashtra the Patels in Gujarat, the Jats in Haryana, and even the Kapus in Andhra Pradesh are more or less rich, land-owning and politically influential communities. But of late, these communities have turned towards the state and are demanding quotas in jobs and higher education institutions because the economic growth in the last 2 decades, which the India has seen, has not brought any real significant growth for them. Now, these Marathas are predominantly agricultural communities and they benefited from the Green and the White Revolution. However, post 1991, there was a structural transformation of the Indian economy, and after such transformation, the emphasis or the importance of agriculture reduced drastically, whereas the services and the private sector came in. Hence, due to the declining importance of agriculture, as well as the growth of corporatized agriculture, has affected the agricultural productivity of these communities, and hence these agricultural communities are feeling more and more vulnerable. Hence, the present agrarian distress which the economy is facing has filled in a lot of fears amongst the agricultural communities because they are losing their stable sources of livelihood. Hence, it is in this context that they want good jobs and stable sources of livelihood. And as you must be knowing, stable jobs and stable sources of livelihood are provided by government jobs. And it is for such communities that reservation and quotas mean access to such government jobs which will provide them with good opportunities and stable sources of livelihood. But here also there is one very interesting observation. Now, even before the Marathas were included in the quota or the reservation system, the access of Marathas to government jobs was already similar to that of Brahmins, and in fact it was much higher than that for other forward caste and other socially backward class such as the ST, SCs or the OBC. So hence, if you see here, in terms of the representation in the government jobs, already they are represented quite well and in fact much better than the ST, SCs and the OBCs. Hence, in totality, we can say that these communities are having some kind of economic anxiety. That is, these communities perceive themselves to be more vulnerable than they actually are in reality. But as the situation is, due to this increasing perceived vulnerability, their demand for quota and reservation is also increasing. Now, lastly, in the conclusion, the author has provided us some really nice insight as to whether reservation is an answer to the problem of caste hierarchies and social discrimination. Now, the first point the author is saying is that privatization is increasing in our country. And since privatization is increasing, the base of government jobs, that is the jobs that are eligible for reservation, that in turn is shrinking because more jobs are becoming privatized and the seats in the government jobs is reducing. Further, the research shows that existing OBCs and the ST/SCs are lagging behind the upper caste on a range of material indicators. Hence, in this context, extending quotas to relatively richer and powerful groups would amount to diluting the already shrinking entitlement of the real beneficiaries, that is the ST, SCs and the OBCs. Which simply means that despite reservation, there has not been much improvement in the lives of the STs, SCs and OBCs who are actually backward in reality. On top of that, if we start giving reservation to people who are relatively still better off than these real beneficiaries, then in turn we are diluting the actual purpose of reservation, which was to correct the historical injustice and to give an upthrust to people who are socially and educationally backward. And lastly, the author is saying, in turn of providing reservation, we should actually try to address the real issues at hand. That is, the lynching of the Dalits for pursuing their traditional occupations, snatching away their jobs in name of cow protection, violence which is targeted at them due to intercaste marriages, and other such violence related to temple entry, etc. So rather than focusing on reservation, we should actually try to address all these issues which in reality are reinforcing these caste hierarchies, because at one hand, reservation is not able to actually bring in the changes for which it was brought in, and on the other hand, issues such as lynching, untouchability, etc. are further reinforcing the caste discrimination and hierarchies. Hence, in conclusion, we can say that the government has to discuss ways and find solutions to break these caste hierarchies and not reinforce them through actions such as lynching and untouchability, or try to dilute the benefit meant for such caste by giving away their share of reservation to relatively better off caste or communities. Now, based on the discussion of this article, please try and attempt this mains question. With this, let's move on to our next news. This news is an editorial appearing on page number 10 and is in relationship with sedition. Now, the topic of sedition becomes very important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 in the category of polity, especially when we talk about the freedom of speech and expression. The context of the news is that recently a prominent pro-LTTE politician, Mr. Waiko, has been convicted on the charges of sedition. Hence, in this editorial, the author is putting forth a case to scrap section 124A of the Indian Penal Code, which talks about sedition. Let's start with what exactly is sedition. Now, sedition is a criminal offence defined under section 124 of the Indian Penal Code. Section 124A of the IPC defines sedition as whoever by words, either spoken or written, or by signs, or by any visible representation or otherwise, brings or attempts to bring into hatred and contempt, or excites or attempts to excite dissatisfaction towards the government established by law, shall be punished with imprisonment for life, to which fine may be added, or with imprisonment which may extend to 3 years, to which fine may be added, or with fine. So this definition has certain constituents. The first is any person with words which can either be spoken or written, or even by signs or some other kind of visible representation. A good example of visible representation will be the cartoons by Indian cartoonist Aseem Trivedi, who was jailed on sedition charges. So whoever by all these actions brings or even attempts to bring, hence in sedition even an attempt is punishable. So if the actions are bringing or attempting to bring hatred or contempt, or is trying to excite any kind of dissatisfaction towards the government, then that person will be charged with sedition, punishment for which varies from 3 years to imprisonment for life. Further, the section provides us with certain explanation, according to which, firstly, dissatisfaction would include any kind of disloyalty or a feeling of enmity towards the government. Secondly, in explanation, we have been provided with 2 exceptions to this law of sedition. The first is any kind of comments which is expressing any kind of condemnation towards the measure of the government with an intent or with a view to obtain a change or alteration of that government measures, and if such comments do not have the attention to excite hatred, contempt or dissatisfaction, then they will not constitute an offence under this section. Therefore, if a person does not have the intention to excite hatred, contempt or dissatisfaction, but is rather only expressing his dissatisfaction with certain measures of the government and is criticizing the government just to bring an alteration of such measures, then that will not constitute as sedition. Hence, the section itself recognizes that healthy criticism is an exception to sedition. The second exception is similar. Whoever through his comments is trying to express disapprobation means condemnation. Hence, whoever is condemning the administrative or any other kind of action of the government without exciting hatred or contempt, then that too will not constitute an offence under this section. Now, generally the debates around sedition is centered on sedition versus the freedom of speech and expression. Now, we know that Article 19(1) guarantees the freedom of speech and expression, which is subject to certain reasonable limitations or restriction provided for under Article 19(2). Now, the reasonable restrictions provided under Article 19(2) includes the interest of the sovereignty and the integrity of India, the security of the state, friendly relation with foreign states, public order, decency or morality, or in relation to contempt of court, defamation or incitement to an offence. So, usually it is said that sedition flows from this reasonable limitations provided for under Article 19 Clause 2, specifically protecting the sovereignty and integrity of India as well as the security of the state, and in order to maintain public order, decency or morality. Next, let us talk about the author's view which are presented in this article. The first and the foremost is the most common criticism to sedition, that is, sedition is being used as a tool to curb the political dissent. The author says that it is a matter of concern that political speeches are being criminalized to the extent that they are deemed to be an offence against the state. In fact, in recent years, there has been an alarming rise in sedition charges because it is being used as a reprehensible measure to curb political dissent. Secondly, the author feels that there is another school of thought which feels that a modern democracy like India does not need a free speech restriction which is based on colonial concepts of speech restrictions. Because even Britain, who introduced this offence of sedition way back in 1870 in order to curb the political dissent of Indians back then, so that they cannot criticize the colonial administration, they too have abolished sedition. Thirdly, the author feels that the real mischief or the real problem with sedition lies in its definition, which is very wide in scope. Because its definition also takes into fold not just incitement to take up arms, but also harmless criticism of the government policies or actions. Therefore, by using sedition, even criticism of the government of the day is not allowed. Hence, the author feels that this vague and wide scope of the definition of sedition opens up a lot of room for debate as to whether that action did cause sedition or not. Now, in addition to author's view, there are other 2 points as well. Fourth is that gauging whether a person had the intention to incite disaffection towards the government or whether his actions had the tendency or the potential to incite such kind of hatred or contempt is again very subjective. Because of the fact that the law has not provided us with certain quantifiable tests to see what amounts to sedition, in the end, gauging the intent and tendency is left to the court itself, which again can become very subjective. Lastly, in a modern parliamentary democracy like ours, the citizens of our country have the right to information. That is, they have the right to gather information on government policies and action. And further, they also have the fundamental right of freedom of speech and expression to criticize the actions of the government. Because obviously, if a citizen is dissatisfied with the government policies, he has the right to criticize it. Because until and unless the dissatisfaction is not voiced, the government can also not be held accountable. So these are the major points against sedition. Let us also very briefly look what the Law Commission and the Supreme Court of India has said about sedition. Let us talk about the various judgments of the Supreme Court and the opinion it has shared on sedition. Now, the Supreme Court in the case of Ramesh Thapar versus the State of Madras declared that unless the freedom of speech and expression threaten the security of our country or tend to overthrow the state or the government, any law imposing restriction upon the same will not fall within the purview of Article 19 Clause 2 of the Constitution. Hence, in this case, it said that only those actions which are threatening security of our country or have the actual potential to overthrow the present government, only those cases can be tried for sedition. Then in the year 1962, the Supreme Court in the case of Kedarnath versus the state of Bihar ruled in favor of the constitutional validity of Section 124A of the IPC and in fact tried to strike a balance between Article 19(1) and Section 124A of the IPC. In Kedarnath, the court said that a person shall be prosecuted for sedition only if his acts caused incitement to violence or his acts had the intention or the tendency to create public disorder or cause disturbance of the public peace. Hence, in Kedarnath, the court said there has to be some real tendency or a real potential of an action of the accused to create public disorder, and not just anything, including a mere criticism, can be considered to bring in a turmoil. Now, recently, even the Law Commission of India came out with a consultation paper on sedition. Now, the Law Commission observed that dissent and criticism are essential ingredients of a robust public debate in a vibrant democracy like India. So, therefore, if today India cannot be open to positive criticism, then there is actually no difference between the pre and the post-independence era. Further, the Law Commission emphasized on the fundamental right given under Article 19 of the Constitution, where the people have the right to criticize their own history and their government. Further, the Law Commission said that every restriction which is placed on free speech and expression has to be carefully scrutinized in order to avoid unwarranted restrictions. Which simply means that just because the Constitution under Article 19 Clause 2 has provided for certain reasonable restriction, that does not mean that the government will invoke such restrictions as and when they like for every kind of political dissent or criticism. Further, the Law Commission said that people in this country have the liberty and the freedom to express their affections toward the government or towards the country in a way they want to. Hence, it said that singing from the same song book is not a benchmark of patriotism. Patriotism is subjective and everybody has the right to express it the way they want it. Next, a mere expression of frustration over the state of affairs in a country cannot be treated as sedition. So just because somebody is expressing a view or a thought which is not in congruity or in consonance with the political view of the ruling party or with the majority of the people does not mean that the person has to be charged under the provision of sedition. And lastly, the Law Commission considered whether it will be worthwhile to rename Section 124A and also to find a suitable substitute for the term sedition. So this was all for the article. Based on a discussion, please try and attempt this mains practice question. With this, let's move on to our next news. The next discussion will be based on an article appearing on page number 10, which is in reference with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. This discussion of ours will become important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 under the category of International Relation and the subtopic of regional and global groupings involving India's affecting India's interest as well as important international institution. The context of the news is that recently the 12th Extraordinary Summit of the African Union was held at Niamey, which is the capital of the Niger Republic. Now in this extraordinary summit, 54 out of the 55 members of the African Union states signed the African Continental Free Trade Agreement for goods and services. Out of these countries, 27 have already ratified it. So before discussing what are the hurdles and the roadblocks which the author has mentioned, we will first talk about what is African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Now as far as the background or origin of the African Continental FTA is concerned, the decision to establish a continental free trade area by the year 2017 was taken at the 18th session of the African Union, which was held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in the year 2012. Hence, the idea of an African Continental Free Trade Agreement was born in the year 2012. Later on, most of the African countries met in Kigali, Rwanda in 2018 and they signed the African Continental Free Trade Area and the Protocol. And this led to the Kigali Declaration, which established the African Economic Community. Now, the significance of the African Continental FTA is that it will be the world's largest free trade agreement because it has an intention to create an African common market of about 1.2 billion people and a total GDP worth over $3 trillion. Now, in the editorial, it is mentioning GDP of over 3.4 billion, but I believe that is a typographical error. It should be over 3 trillion. Further, this will also be the world's largest single market. And this continental trade deal will also be the world's largest trade group ever since the creation of the World Trade Organization. Now, as far as the objective of the African Continental FTA is concerned, the foremost of them is to create a single continental market for goods and services, which will be the world's largest single market. Second, it wants that there should be a free movement of business persons and investments. Thirdly, it wants to establish the Continental Customs Union and the African Customs Union. It also aims to expand intra-African trade. Next, it wants that there should be a coordination amongst its members as far as trade facilitation regimes and instruments are concerned. Moreover, it also wants to enhance competitiveness both for the industry and the enterprise on a pan-African level. And lastly, it wants to exploit opportunities for mass-scale production as well as continental market access. So this is the basic about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Let us now discuss some of the hurdles and the roadblocks which the author has mentioned for the African Continental Trade Agreement. Now the author says that the African Union has been largely ineffective in dealing with the continent's various problems. And therefore, considering the past experience and the failures of the African Union, the author has serious apprehensions regarding the efficiency and the effective implementation of this African Continental Trade Agreement. Secondly, the author says that the AFCFTA has to work against the ongoing global protectionist trends as seen in the US-China trade conflict, Brexit, and the problems in the WTO functioning. The third challenge is that currently the intra-Africa trade comprises just 15% of the continent's total trade. And this is quite low when compared to regional trade in other continents. For example, in Europe, the intra-trade is almost 67%. For Asia, it is 58%. For America, it is 48%, etc. Now, the fourth issue is that the exports of most African countries are predominantly primary commodities. So, hence, the author feels that the African countries have to diversify the commodities they trade in and should also start trading in secondary and other commodities. Because obviously, if every country is producing similar primary commodities, what will they trade in? Hence, the author feels that if this has to be successful, the countries have to lower the production of primary commodities and should move on to produce more secondary and other kind of commodities. Fifth, the author says most African countries lack in additive manufacturing, automation, or other fourth industrial revolution innovations. Hence, the author says that lack of such innovation or modern technology is an issue which will not be resolved by continental free trade agreement. Therefore, if this FTA has to be successful, African Union first need to work on its technology and innovation so that they can have better technology in place which will help reduce their cost of manufacturing. Sixth issue is that negotiations on important issues like the intellectual property rights, tariff for some goods, etc. are still ongoing among the African Union members. And lastly, the author says, Niger and South Africa, which are the two largest economies of Africa, have shown reluctance to join this African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So if the two largest economies of Africa only don't join it, then this free trade agreement will not be successful because the intra-trade in Africa will remain low. Next, let us talk about what will be the impact of African Continental Free Trade Agreement on India. Now, Africa is an important economic partner for India, with total annual merchandise trade estimated at $70 billion. Further, India is Africa's third largest trading partner. Moreover, India's global exports have weakened due to the economic slowdown. However, India's exports to Africa have increased. Now, Africa has a strong demand market for goods and services that India produces, such as automobiles, pharmaceuticals, consumer goods, healthcare, education, etc. Hence, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will ensure that African economies will become much more formalized and transparent in their functioning, and this of course will be beneficial for India. Further, the author says, though it might happen that the local manufactured items and services may ultimately compete with Indian exports, however, it also provides Indian firms an opportunity for joint ventures with the African firms. Next, India has donated approximately $15 million to Niger to fund the Niamey African Union Summit. Hence, the author says, similarly, India can also help the African Union to prepare the requisite architecture such as common external tariffs, competition policy, intellectual property rights, natural persons movement, etc. Lastly, the author says, after the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is accepted and implemented in Africa, both India and Africa can negotiate for an Indian-African Free Trade Agreement in the future. In addition to this, India can augment its economic strength in Africa by engaging with Indian diaspora in Africa. Now, the topic of African Union has been covered comprehensively in the July edition of the Focus. You can refer to this July edition, which talks about the mandate of the African Union, its structure, and it also talks about African Continental Free Trade Area. The same information has also been provided for in the PDF. With this, let's move on to our next news. This news appears on page number 8 and is stating that the Karnataka government is offering reservation for the girl children of trafficked women or women who were Devadasi. Hence, in our discussion today, we'll be talking about the Devadasi system. Hence, our discussion of Devadasi will become important from the perspective of GS Paper 1, both under the category of history as well as social issues. Now, the context of the news is that the Karnataka government has decided to give 1% reservation to the girl child of women who were trafficked or were victims of sexual assault or were Devadasis. And this reservation will be provided in state educational institutions. Now, the term Devadasi literally means female slave to God. It is a religious practice of dedicating young girls to the temples as an offering to appease the gods. This practice persists mainly in South India, especially in the states of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. Now, the main duty of the Devadasi was to commit a life without marriage and to dedicate all their life to the temple and the gods. In fact, they acted as temple caretakers and performed rituals, dances, and music in the honor of the deity. In fact, the Devadasis were also expected to provide sexual favors to the members belonging to the higher social and financial status. Now, in recent decades, this practice of Devadasi has been used to push young girls into prostitution. Now, realizing the fact that this practice was used to push young girls into slave trade and prostitution as well as is being used to further human trafficking, the Karnataka government came out with the Karnataka Devadasi Prohibition of Dedication Act of 1982. But despite these laws to stop such practices, the tradition still remains entrenched. Let us see why. Now, many people who perpetuate the Devadasi system believe that if they dedicate a younger girl, the goddesses will bless that girl and their family. Hence, such superstitious belief is one reason for its perpetuation. Second, many girls who are willing to enter this system view the Devadasi system as the only way to rise in India's rigid caste system. In fact, lower caste individuals who become Devadasis have the choice of either entering the practice or taking part in a distinct number of menial occupations. And since most of these menial jobs do not pay enough to sustain an individual, hence a lot of women even willingly move to the Devadasi system in order to sustain themselves. Additionally, the Devadasi system continue to receive customary sanction. Firstly, there is society's acceptance. Devadasi dedication and the resulting sexual abuse of these girl children are accepted and celebrated by the society. Those willing to report also fear the backlash of the society and community and hence stay away from reporting. Next, there are non-willing or non-cooperative victims. Unwillingness of the victim to report against their parents or relatives becomes a big challenge. Even if the case is registered, there is a high probability of the victim turning hostile. Third, there is a lack of police action. The police are failing to take adequate action in cases of dedication and are not registering cases coming to them due to pressure from the community. Further, there is the poor implementation of the legislation. In fact, the Karnataka Devadasi Act was passed in the year 1992, yet the state government has failed to issue the rules for administering the law. Let us now talk about some of the issues associated with the practice of Devadasi. First are the health risks which are associated. The Devadasis who are found into prostitution become vulnerable to sexually transmitted diseases, especially HIV/AIDS. Now, despite sufficient evidence of prevalence of the practice of Devadasi and its link to sexual exploitation, recent legislation, for example, the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, Juvenile Justice Act, etc., do not specifically mention about prohibition of Devadasi custom as a form of sexual exploitation of children. Further, even the proposed Trafficking of Persons Prevention, Protection and Rehabilitation Bill of 2018 also does not recognize these dedicated girls as victims of trafficking for sexual purposes. Lastly, as a way forward, what is required? Firstly, is that state should enhance the livelihood sources for the weaker section of the society so that women, especially from the lower caste, do not enter into the system of Devadasi. Secondly, the state must also provide for the proper rehabilitation of such women by establishing adult schools for them, further by creating support groups with the help of NGOs. Thirdly, there is a dire need that awareness generation about the provision of the legislation in communities where this prevalence of Devadasi system is high should be started. Fourth, we require proper implementation of laws. As mentioned earlier, it's high time that the state government makes rule for administering the Karnataka Devadasi Prohibition of Dedication Act of 1982. Fifth, it is felt that the Department of Women and Child Development should conduct periodical surveys to better understand the prevalence and trend of the Devadasi system so that they can provide better rehabilitation to those affected. Sixth, there is a need to have better coordination between the departments, agencies and other functionaries because it is leading to ineffective efforts to stop the practice of Devadasi dedication. Now, based on the discussion of this topic, please try and attempt this mains practice question. With this, let's move on to our next news. This next news appears on page number 15 and reads, SEBI gets teeth to probe new age cases. Now, the context of the news is that the Finance Bill of 2019 has brought in an amendment to strengthen the role of SEBI to act against entities that tamper or destroy electronic databases or fail to furnish information. Now, the Finance Bill has introduced a new section, namely Section 15HAA in the SEBI Act. This section states that if a person tampers with information to obstruct or influence an investigation, or if that person destroys any kind of regulatory data or tries to access data in an unauthorized manner, then that entity will be penalized up to 10 crore rupees or 3 times the unlawful gains, whichever is higher. And the reason for adding this section is that of late, there have been a lot of leakages of sensitive financial information of various companies through WhatsApp messages. Now, the challenges or concerns with bringing in this new section is that this new section 15HAA is very wide in scope and does not clearly define the scope of the regulatory data. Further, it is unclear that whether the term regulatory data and the database which is used in section 15HAA, whether it is limited to only SEBI or is meant to cover all the data at system database maintained by SEBI, stock exchanges, depositors and clearing corporations. But having said so, you need to keep in mind that the finance bill has just been tabled and there might be a lot of changes in this section 15HAA. Hence, this is a news in transition and we would have to wait for the finance bill to be passed to see exactly in what form this section 15HAA will be finalized. So with this, let's move on to our practice questions. Now, based on our discussion, here is the first set of your prelims practice question. Please pause the video and solve them. We'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. Question number 1 reads, which of the following are reasonable restrictions to freedom of speech and expression under Article 19 Clause 2? The first, interest of the sovereignty and integrity of India. This is correct. Second, friendly relations with foreign state. This is also correct. Third, public order, decency or morality. This is also right. And fourth, in relation to contempt of court, defamation or incitement to an offence. This is also correct. Hence, the right answer is D, all of the above. Question number 2 reads, which of the following cases is related to sedition? Now, the right answer to this question is D, Kedarnath versus State of Bihar. Option number A, J.P. Unnikrishnan versus the State of Andhra Pradesh is related to right to education. Keshavanand Bharati versus Union of India is related to the basic structure of the Indian Constitution and plethora of other issues. C. MC Mehta versus Union of India. Now, there are a lot of cases named as MC Mehta versus Union of India, but majority of them are related to environment. So, the right answer is D, Kedarnath versus State of Bihar. Now, here is the second set of prelims practice question. Please again pause the video and solve it. We'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. Question number 3 reads, which of the following are objectives of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? First, create a single continental market for goods and services. This is correct. Second, free movement of business persons and investments. This is also right. Third, expand intra-Africa trade. This is also correct. And fourth, coordination amongst members for trade facilitation regimes and instruments. This is also right. Hence, the right answer is D, all of the above. Question number 4 is in relation to the Devadasi system. The first statement, it is mostly prevalent in Northeast India. This is incorrect. It is mostly prevalent in South India. Second, the practice is recognized as a form of exploitation under the Juvenile Justice Act, but not under the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. Now, this is incorrect. The practice of Devadasi has not been recognized specifically under any of the legislation, neither Juvenile Justice Act nor the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences. Therefore, the right answer to this question becomes D, neither 1 nor 2. With this, we come to an end for today's discussion. Let's move to the question for the day.